Technology is no longer a side hustle. Technology is the main arena of geopolitical competition in the 21st century.
Do you think the Western governments are adapting quickly enough in order for them to move it forward into that operational space?
In a word, no. One way of categorizing it is this: the 20th century, we won wars by outproducing the enemy. So if you look at World War II, UK's role there was to stand alone, to maintain the resistance, if you like, and then to get America into the war with its huge industrial capacity.
I think the UK can be at the head of that, not just for innovating the technologies, but also working with other partners to cooperate.
Other than US and China, who are the big kids in this particular playground, we are as well placed as any, what Mark Carney would call the middle powers or the medium-sized nations to benefit from the coming years.
Are you pre-prepared for what may or may not come, but as long as you're always ready? There's a saying in the military, fail to plan, plan to fail. So I think that's the key.
Absolutely, and we also have a saying in the military that we usually prepare for the last war. So we need to be really thoughtful, and we bandy around these terms, war and peace. I mean, I think we're in a period of not war and not peace.
Do you think that the skills are clearly going to change? I mean, what skills do you think are going to particularly matter in the next decade or so?
Let's say that.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of The Digital State, where we talk everything from government and its relationship to tech. We're going to talk a lot today about defence, but also how the AI phenomenon is basically expanding around the world, and how the UK government needs to be looking at how it can keep pace, not just for defence, but in innovation, and if we're going to get the growth of this country going, and also how we take people along with us on that journey. So, Asad, I mean, it's really important that, especially when we're looking at defence, this is something you've got experience on, is how we check what the UK government is doing to be able to keep pace. We see other countries really innovating, using AI, using unconventional warfare techniques, and the technology that goes behind that. I think, it's not necessarily the capability. Which of you have you got more technology than your enemy? Can you adapt quicker than the rest?
I think certainly, but what comes into that is how do we shape national resilience for the UK, and that's across space, AI, cyber, and data specifically, because that's your foundational, mesh for anything that you're doing across technology these days. But cyber resilience doesn't just come in one force, it has to be the armed forces collectively. So you've got Navy, Air Force, Army and Space Force as well, which the Royal Air Force manage for the UK. And it's how do we strengthen our capabilities in country, and then of course, with our allies across the world, how is that used collectively? So I mean, the big topic this week has been the Defence Investment Plan that has come out, and how the government is going to work with the armed forces to unlock the budgets that they need across different forces, across what is important to the UK now. So as I said, this is a national infrastructure that we're looking at, and we've got a brilliant speaker who's done this for decades across his career with the Army, and we'll be hearing insights from our guest speaker here today.
Well, with no further ado, let me introduce him. He's Lieutenant General Sir Tom Richardson Copinger-Symes, and he's a former senior British Army officer. Last served as the Deputy Commander of the Cyber and Specialist Operation Command. He was also the General Officer Commanding Force Troops Command and Director of Military Digitisation Strategic Command as well. And now he's doing a lot of different things. He's the chair of the International Defence Esports Games, going back to the esports that we're going to talk about a little bit later on. A strategic advisor to the Hacking Games, and again, that's something that we could explore. Be really interesting to explore. And you're a consultant to a number of different organisations looking at digital transformation, cybersecurity, data, AI, space, and critical national infrastructure, and of course, defence and private capital, which we'll explore. I know is something that you work very closely on. So, Lieutenant General Sir Tom, lovely to see you.
Thank you for having me. Privilege.
So I think if we start off really at the first bit about defence, we started off at the top talking a lot about defence and the defence of this nation, and the security of this nation, because it is wider than just traditional warfare. I talked a little bit about unconventional warfare. How do you think technology and AI is really transforming that, and how do you think we need to position ourselves as a country, especially when we are talking to the taxpayer that's funding the investment plan that Asad was talking about?
So, thank you for having me. I think the big point to make here is that technology is no longer a side hustle. Technology is the main arena of geopolitical competition in the 21st century. So it's not just helping old-fashioned warfare and politics and state-on-state adversarial competition. It is the arena for that competition. I mean, particularly between the US and China, but not just between the US and China. So I think that's the big realization people haven't got to yet. And, tech is ripping up the rules-based international order. Some people would blame that on different politicians. I would say that some of them accelerating it, but frankly, tech is ripping up that rules-based order. And of course, different states who didn't feel that they were getting what they wanted from it are ripping it up. And some of our adversaries, Russia in particular, is sort of weaponizing that rules-based order against us. So I think it's that nexus of tech and geopolitics that we're taking a while to understand the world has changed, and we're not going back to a status quo ante. We're going forward into a very disruptive, chaotic world that probably feels like the period after the invention of the printing press more than any other time in history. And that has huge potential, huge opportunity, huge benefit from humanity. I mean, who wouldn't want the printing press? But we also have to acknowledge just how disrupted that couple of 100 years after Gutenberg was, sort of between the early 1400s and the middle of the 1600s. And strap in, it's going to be a rocky old ride, but there's also masses of opportunity for those who want to seize it.
So we'll come back to the opportunity in a second. I mean, what's your view about how we can minimise that period of disruption to really focus in on what's important for the UK?
So I think firstly, you've got to recognise the period of history you're in.
Yeah.
And we keep on measuring AI and when we talk about data, we could talk about the internet, AI, data, the coming quantum revolution. It's this massive democratization of data, information, into the hands of people who didn't used to have that information. And that gives huge power and empowerment to a different bunch of people. Just like when Gutenberg invented the printing press, suddenly, your Bible didn't have to be handwritten by a monk on an old calf skin. You could print it and people get hold of the Bible and other texts, in person, and they weren't then intermediated. So it shifts power. And one of the things I try and get over to people is we keep trying to measure AI by its productive capacity, which is huge, particularly as we get into robotic autonomy and we get more machines, whether it's on the battlefield or in industry. There's going to be huge productivity gains. But that misses the essential point. This is an information technology, not just an industrial technology. So AI changes the way we look at the world, and it changes fundamental power relationships between governments and the governed, between citizens and each other, with religions, with pretty much everything about the way we run the world at the moment. And one of the features, again, that I think we're taking a while to understand is these corporations, these very, very big, powerful corporations, so the big tech in the US, but also there's some very significant Chinese ones and there are others around the world. These are becoming geopolitical players in their own right. And that's very new in the past few hundred years, that you go back to these huge corporations that have the power, more power and more money than most medium-sized states. That's changing geopolitics fundamentally. So you've got to recognize the phase you're in, and you've got to recognize that this is about an information revolution, not just an industrial revolution.
It sounds like then, because we talked about defense, and as I said, it's not all about by the time the first bullet is fired or shell is fired or missile has been launched. You and I probably studied Sun Tzu for very different reasons. Me, when I was a fledgling salesman, you obviously at Sandhurst, I'm sure, and the Sun Tzu's seminal work, The Art of War. And so much of that was about preparing the battlefield. It was confusing the enemy. It's all of those kind of things before you even in battle. And it feels like some of the period we are in at the moment, which is getting people to understand, the politicians and the leaders to understand the risk, is about that period of disruption before possible conflict.
That's why this idea of AI as an information technology, not just an industrial technology, is so important, because that's what we're seeing play out. And, Sun Tzu used to say, the art of war, the acme of war, is winning without fighting. And, we have two very significant adversaries, in fact, 3 or 4, who've been very public in their pronouncements. They don't want to fight. Why would you want to fight the US and its allies in a world where they are kinetically more powerful than the adversary? But because we're democracies, we wear our fractures on the outside, and we're allowing our adversaries to get in and pull those fractures apart and make them even worse. And of course, I think the most sort of prominent example at the moment is in Midnight Hammer, when the US struck outside Tehran. 5% of the Scottish nationalists' influence bots disappeared overnight because they're based in Tehran. Now, nobody in Tehran gives a monkeys whether Scotland is part of the Union or not. What they care about is exaggerating the divide between Unionists and nationalists and pulling apart our society. And that's just one tiny example. Almost everything that you find a disagreement in the UK at the moment, you'll find our adversaries in there using the internet to pull us aside and pull us to the extremes rather than into the middle where you find compromise and common cause.
Now, you and I are a similar vintage, I think, and so you'll probably remember being very glib now in the 1980s when music producers first discovered and video producers discovered computers, and videos were just zipping all over the place because someone was just pressing too many buttons because they just had this new toy to play with. It feels in industry, I don't know about defence, but it certainly feels in industry sometimes everybody wants to get on the AI bandwagon, technology bandwagon. Is there a risk of being over-reliant at this stage on technologies, and especially AI and automation?
Yeah, look, I think when we were kids, we called them crazes, didn't we? Do you remember? There was a craze for this, that, and the other. We're definitely in an LLM Gen AI craze at the moment. And that has got lots of good things about it, and it's got some pretty shoddy things about it. And quite hard to draw on a podcast, but if AI is this, and I'm making a gesture with my hands that there's a very big circle, LLMs are a very small part of that. And we need to ride the wave of LLMs and Gen AI, but also remember there's an awful lot of artificial intelligence out beyond that. And actually, as we start to rebalance and look where the UK and our friends can actually gain ground and sort of regain some sovereignty in this, it might be from the research into those other areas of AI, into smaller language models, into different forms of AI, that we get our competitive advantage as we go on.
I think, Jonathan, what Paul has mentioned around risk here, and there are, of course, risks across cyber, data, AI, which ultimately, after you've done your strategic thinking and moved on ahead, it can get into warfare. And when you have to operationalize it, what do you feel, do you think, the point I made around pace as well, do you think the Western governments are adapting quickly enough in order for them to move it forward into that operational space?
In a word, no. Look, if I can come back, I mentioned a learning, an information technology, not an industrial technology, or as well as an industrial technology. I think the one way of categorizing it is this: the 20th century, we won wars by outproducing the enemy. So if you look at World War II, just as one example, the UK's role there was to stand alone, to maintain the resistance, if you like, and then to get America into the war with its huge industrial capacity. Largely founded on the automotive industry, you bring those practices in to warfare, and you then outproduce the enemy. And you provide tanks for Russia, and you provide kit for the UK, and yada yada. So you outproduce. Now, of course, outproducing your enemy is still very valuable. Ask a Ukrainian, ask a Russian. But the key thing in the 21st century in an information age is outlearning your enemy. And if you outlearn and then outproduce, you get that scalar, you get that exponential effect. And what we're seeing with Ukraine is a much smaller nation than Russia outlearning its energy, and then, of course, its friends helping it outproduce. But be clear now, it is Ukraine outproducing, and they have this huge productive capacity now in Ukraine. So they've done both, but it's the learning that allows you to produce the right things, and that provides your advantage. And not just in wartime, of course, that provides your advantage in peacetime too.
And it has to be interoperable as well, because this is the point. You have to work with your partners, you have to work with your allies, and making sure that everybody is on board with the same technology. But we can innovate that, and we can presumably, though, have, it's important, and maybe get your views on how you think the UK can be at the head of that, not just for innovating the technologies, but also working with other partners to cooperate.
Yeah, so I think one of the themes here for me is, whilst it is a very risky 20 or 30 years ahead of us, there are these huge opportunities. And I think the UK, I mean, other than US and China, who are the big kids in this particular playground, we are as well placed as any, what Mark Carney would call the middle powers or the, medium-sized nations to benefit from the coming years. And of course, if we play it wrong, we have as much to lose as anybody else, because actually we occupy a very lucky position in the world at the moment. So we have those advantages. I mean, you mentioned interoperability. It's easy to move over the fact we're speaking in the lingua franca of the 21st century without risk of upsetting the French. English is the language of interoperability and cooperation. And we seem to forget just how fundamental that is. We have spare cognitive power that we can either use to learn other languages or we can use for other stuff. That's just a huge advantage we've got that we seem to have forgotten about. And we also have an amazing tech base in this country. We have amazing, of the 10 top AI universities in the world, we have 4 of them. And of course, AI is no longer just about university, it's about raw talent. We have amazing apprenticeship programs and so on. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but this country has huge potential if only we can leverage it properly into that competition.
So if we want to then bring government into this and have them procure to the best of their ability to make sure that we are at the lead, do you think traditional procurement can actually keep pace with this kind of change?
I would have to have been drinking very early today to think that traditional procurement can keep pace. And I think everybody recognises that, not least the primes, the people who are generally criticised for this. And of course, before we criticise them too much, we've got to remember that the primes mirror their customer. Yeah. They mirror defence, they mirror government. And I'm afraid, we've got to sort this out. I mean, I've very recently left defence, literally a month ago. So this is not me othering and saying it's government's fault. I've been part of that for, as Asad said, nearly 4 decades. So that's our fault. Nobody else's fault. We've allowed that to be created over the past decades, and we've got to change it. One of the routes to doing that is recognising that defence, instead of thinking that we're 80% different and 20% the same as every other sector, I think we need to recognise we're 80% the same and 20% different. That 20% is really important difference. Ethically, morally, some of the specialisms, it's very different. But there's a lot of saving in time and money if we can recognise that we're 80% the same as other big enterprises rather than 80% different.
That's really interesting, because primes are the key strategic suppliers that do provide capability, technology, not just to government, but defence very heavily as well. I think one of the key areas where I spoke to lots of primes over my years working in tech, there's a common theme around, for example, direct awards to bring things a lot faster to market. And one of the programs that we'd been working on, that was exactly it, where it would have been at least 12, maybe even 24 months just for that procurement cycle to have ran. And across that time, thanks to it being a direct award with the understanding in place, we've been delivering and helping make public life run faster for the specific area that I'm referring to. So what's your take on that, General Tom?
Well, so I think we're going to end up with a much more complex and more diversified supply chain. That's got to be part of the answer. In defence of the primes, and I spend most of my time, helping SMEs. But in defence of the primes, we have a supply chain crisis at the moment in the UK. And one of the features of the primes that are really important is they have weight in the supply chain. If you just look at chips, getting a hold of chips at the moment is really, really hard. And SMEs are at the back of the queue. They're too small to make an impact. And that will have to be the role of government too. How do we make sure we get the minerals, the chips, the real bottom of the supply chain? How do we have enough voice in that? And SMEs will never be able to achieve that on their own. They will, of course, find innovative routes round that, and we need to harvest that innovation itself about how you hack the supply chain. But in terms of weight in the supply chain, you do need governments and big industry. But they can be enhanced, and their innovation can be enhanced hugely by SMEs. And we have one of the best startup ecosystems in the world in the UK, not just in defence, but more broadly. What we're failing to do, as I think everybody recognises now, is scale up. And I think really it's that scaling that we need to address next.
Well, that'd be interesting then to get your take on private capital coming in and how it can sit alongside national capability as well, because you're absolutely right in terms of scale up. You know, when I was business minister and tech minister, it was always how we build a UK playbook. We start here, you can do Series A, Series B, Series C, you're struggling, you tend to go West Coast America, and then the non-execs will take you to why aren't you listing on NASDAQ? Why are you not staying here on the LSE? But in wider terms, in terms of funding, where do you think the role of private capital is to enhance a national offering?
Well, look, it's across the sort of private capital pipeline from sort of early seed venture through to private equity and beyond. And of course, the pension market has, I think everybody recognises we need to get a grip of exactly how the pension market can invest in equities in the round, but also in formally prescribed non-ESG areas. But I think just before we move into the detail of private capital, there's a fundamental here that I think is uniquely British, and I just want to call out. So we talk a lot about scaling. Of course, the flip side of scaling is failing. Yep. And one of the great things in the Valley and in the US more broadly is not only do they scale well, but they fail well. They have actually we have quite a good insolvency law here, as I understand it. But culturally, we punish people for failing. And I think at the moment it's fair to say, and I'm going to exaggerate for effect, at the moment, if you do well in Britain, people want to pull you down. If you do badly in Britain, they want to grind you down, which leaves a thin layer of mediocrity in the middle. Now, I'm not looking to insult the people who have been really successful, nor the people who have bounced back after failure. But I think we uniquely punish both success and failure. And that's got to change culturally. And I think we need to get back to a recognition that failing, having tried, is a lot better than not having tried at all. So I think scaling and failing culturally we've got to get to, and maybe find our mojo from maybe a couple of 100 years ago when we were much better at scaling and failing. And, there's a bit more dynamism, could I say a bit more hustle going on at the time. So I think that's important. And of course, why does private capital help with that? Because private capital is brilliant at understanding risk and getting that cycle of scaling and failing, and also redeploying talent when a company does fail in early stage, of redeploying that talent, using the learning to make sure that the next time they win and do better than they did the first time. So I think that's the sort of the cultural piece. Then I think it's for government to spell out in greater detail than I think we've been able to so far about exactly what cycle times and what margins different bits of private capital can expect, across a software play or an infrastructure play or whatever else.
Yeah, it's not always immediate. They've got patient capital, pensions, and that immediate VC private equity type of approach as well. I mean, how do you think we can better get the government to better use the commercialisation of defence? Now, that might be development of private capital, but it's also, I suppose, how do we sell that better into the taxpayer? There's a lot of talk about defence bonds, for example. How can we explain to taxpayers why investment in defence is so important, especially when the wars, the conflicts they see, they're highly political, and some of them, and they're a long way away. A lot of people, younger people, don't remember the Second World War and conflicts that we've been in here. The Falklands War even is a long time ago for our youngsters. So people are feeling more and more safe whilst the world is getting more and more dangerous.
Yeah, so look, a phrase I use a lot at the moment is meeting people where they are rather than where we might want them to be. I mean, that actually means that retired lieutenant generals aren't necessarily the best spokespeople for this issue, because I think a lot of youngsters would look at me and say, well, of course he thinks we need to spend more on defence because he's a retired general. So, having caveated that, I think we do need to meet people where they are and accept that they don't necessarily want to start with a conversation about defence. So find something they are interested in. Growth is a very big issue for everybody. I think resilience is becoming a bigger issue, but again, not everybody quite gets the connection between growth and resilience. And then defence is another step forward. So I think that's the first principle. Let's meet people where they are. To the point about war bonds or defence bonds, or I would probably prefer the term deterrence bonds, because I think that captures the mood a bit more. A lot of people don't realize that they were issued in 1936, not in 1939, not in 1940, but beforehand. And whilst I sometimes think some of the World War II, the 1930s parallels are a bit overplayed, there is still value in them, of course. And I totally understand that any government will be nervous about more bonds because, of course, it's more borrowing. And unless you take the bond market through that, you're going to get an adverse reaction. So I totally understand that, and I'm not an economist. What I think might be underestimated is the cognitive impact of mom and pop or grandma and grandpa, or even young kids investing their premium bonds, as it were, into national resilience and defence and having growth come out of that. So that participatory element of being part of your national security and defence in a very organic way, and using that as a barometer for us to understand where people are on that spectrum of engagement, I think might be a really interesting experiment. As I say, I'm not a trained economist. I can't see what it would do to the bond markets, but I wouldn't want to underestimate that cognitive impact. And as we discussed at the start of this is all about cognitive impact at the moment. It's all about seeing, will a nation stand? And there's a phrase which some of us used, and I think it's now being repeated more and more, that armies, navies, air forces win battles, nations win wars, and when you're talking about state-on-state wars with superpowers, alliances win wars, and getting everybody involved in that, everybody involved in deterring that war, that's the greatest way to prevent the war in the first place.
I think from a common person perspective in the UK taxpayer, so to say, maybe that education element is missing for them to actually understand it to the level that you've just described it. And that's where they don't think of deterrence. It's the word war, and that sends alarm bells singing in a negative way. So it's more the proactiveness, and Paul and you self-mentioned about Sun Tzu, the art of war. And how are you pre-prepared for what may or may not come? But as long as you're always ready, there's a saying in the military, fail to plan to fail. So I think that's the key.
So I absolutely, and we also have a saying in the military that we usually prepare for the last war. So we need to be really thoughtful, and we bandy around these terms, war and peace. I mean, I think we're in a period of not war and not peace. So very Sun Tzu in this case, where I think both Russia and other adversaries around the world don't see things in a binary way. Just like they don't separate art and science, they see knowledge as a continuum. They don't see war and peace as separate states. They see it as a continuous competition. And I think we need to be very conscious of that. We do need to recognize that miscalculation could take us into that, dare I say, old-fashioned war at very short notice. We do need to prevent that and aim off for it. But we also need to recognize the competition we're in. And by my judgment, we're not doing that well in that competition at the moment, and they're doing jolly well out of it. So I think we do need that conversation with our people, but not necessarily just in an old sort of World War II image of what war is. We need to recognize what's going on right now. And again, I come back to this cognitive element, I come back to cyber, I come back to misinformation, I look at what's going on in space at the moment, and I come back into that tech race. And of course, that tech race is not just a race of technology, it's a race for ethics and values as well.
It's interesting, isn't it, that if you look at the space races that you're talking about in the 60s, so much of that was led by NASA. I mean, the internet is based on DARPA, defense spending led technology and innovation in those days. Nowadays, it's actually slightly different. Governments can lay the pitch out a little bit, but you've got SpaceX, you've got and companies closer to home that are, so it's the commercial companies that are leading the technologies. That's clearly got to change government thinking about how they can then make the most of that.
Totally agree. And we're back to that sort of 80% the same, 20% different, rather than 80% different, 20% the same. I think because of this democratization of information, the outside world, the outside government is moving much more quickly. That brings huge strength, and it brings also some risks. I mean, not least ethical risks, because if it's all about a profit incentive, you're going to end up with a market, but it's also going to be an unethical market. And of course, at the same time, we're seeing technology rip the rules-based order apart. We're seeing technology render a lot of our rules, our domestic laws, a little bit irrelevant too. And that democratization of information is allowing people to game those laws, game the rules, finding the gaps in between them, and make the law look like an ass. So I think we really need to understand just the phase of history we're in, and the laws, the way that we make laws, parliamentarians cannot keep up with technology at the moment. So what we really need is an ethical form of leadership. Very hard to define. It'll probably take us the rest of the decade to do that on this podcast. But ethical leadership, where you're prepared to sort of cast aside the rules a bit, but to, on balance, work out what is the best thing for the country, the best thing for citizens to do, and to act on that, rather than being hidebound by laws that could be, in some cases, hundreds of years old, but certainly decades old, that aren't serving us well to lead us through these choppy times.
The ethics thing is really interesting. I remember when I was tech minister, I was sat in one of our departmental meetings with the Secretary of State, the other ministers, and all the leading civil servants, and I suggested, this is at the forefront of AI, let's bring in philosophers, let's bring in theologians, let's bring in representatives from different groups. I think they raised their head from their papers and sort of like looked at me and sort of like, bless, and then went back to the agenda. But now you see Anthropic actually doing exactly that in their development, and I think that's something that you talk a lot about.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, normally I get the raised eyebrow when I talk about poets as well as philosophers, but yeah, we need amazing technologists, but we do need to understand this is an information technology. It's pulling us apart the very way we assimilate and understand the world, and that's the realm of philosophy. Now, a lot of people find that a bit highfalutin. But you've got to understand we're right with AI, and with AGI and ASI, so artificial superintelligence, glimmering out there. None of us is quite sure, when we get to recursive self-improvement. So that is when AI starts improving itself without human intermediation. But we talked about that as science fiction for a long time. It's almost in touching distance. So we've got to recognize, the most fundamental things about humanity. What is consciousness? What are we here for? All the stuff that we spent our university years drinking coffee and thinking about if you're a humanities student. Those are absolutely in play now, and it's a time for the humanities to step up as well as technologists to step up. And of course, what the Leadership Act really is, if you're a humanities dude, you need to mug up on technology. And if you're a technology dude, you need to mug up on ethics and philosophy, because it's the interplay between them that is going to really shape the world over the next 20 or 30 years. And whatever grows out of the current rules-based international order, we need to make sure it serves humanity, not our machines, and certainly not the autocrats.
We had an AI conversion course that we launched in the last government when I was minister, which basically said you can go on a year's conversion course that if you hadn't done computer science, if you hadn't done STEM, and it basically the government would pay for every three courses for every one paid for by the private sector, and that was to get that diversification of thinking into it, exactly as you rightly say. And it's interesting then, because this is all about people, right? This is at the moment it is, until we get that ASI and AGI. But at the moment it's all about people, and we've talked a lot about defence, about the risk that technology and governments have in terms of people's security and safety. Another thing that often people talk about is jobs and what it means for people in the future, the changing of jobs, the eradication of jobs, and these kind of things. So it's something we need to consider. I mean, do you think that the skills are clearly going to change? I mean, what skills do you think are going to particularly matter in the next decade or so?
Well, clearly we're seeing at the moment that AI, one of the things AI is really good at, one of the things Gen AI is really good at, is writing code. So a lot of people say, oh, well, that's and there's a sort of gleefulness, some people saying, isn't that great? The same people who created AI, they're going to be put out of work by AI. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, let's say that I won't name a commercially branded model here, but let's say another good frontier models makes a coder 10 times more productive than they are today, with the assistance of their AI, vibe coding tool. We currently have about 25 million professional coders in the world. You got to ask yourself, do we have scope for 250 million coders in the world, i.e. 25 million times 10, with the vibe code tool beside them? I don't know, but I'm going to guess we've got easy enough scope over the next couple of decades for that. So I don't think coding is going out of business. What are the other skills? I mean, I come back to the humanities and philosophy. Critical thinking in a post-truth world is going to be very, very, very important. And, a couple of years ago when people spoke about post-truth world, I used to raise an eyebrow and think that you're being a bit hyperbolic. Now, I think absolutely we're in a post-truth world. And the mass of misinformation and disinformation that's out there, some of it, I'm going to say innocent, as in some of it just naturally occurring, but a lot of it put out there by governments, by non-state actors to deliberately misinform and disinform, I think is a feature. And it's really hard now to separate the fact from the conspiracy theory. And even when you can find out that was a deep fake or a shallow fake, sometimes it's had its effect. So there was that old phrase, I think, again, going back to about 100 years ago, that a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has got its boots on. And you're seeing that now. And even though you can work out that that misinformation was wrong, it's already had its impact. The market has changed. People's behaviors have changed. And even though you can attribute it and call out the lie, it's had its impact and people have moved on. That's a really dangerous time for humanity, for democracy. And I think teaching critical thinking, teaching ethics, we don't have a civics program in this country at the moment. And I think, we need to think really, really deeply about how we equip not just young people, but also us, older people. And I'm talking about those of us with parents and grandparents alive too, finding it very difficult to navigate their world through a digital age that they weren't born into. And they're pounded on whatever platforms they're on, even email, with complete nonsense. And they weren't really educated not to believe that nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right. It's always interesting as well, looking at the other side of the telescope, about digital natives. So young people always talk about the fact that they're born with a smartphone on the end of the wrist, seemingly, doesn't necessarily mean that they understand the wider aspects of digital take-up. How would you see channeling them and focusing that digital native approach to public service, to applications that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so very apropos at the moment, of course. Everybody's fascinated by screen time and, should we ban social media and so on. I mean, look, I think it's fair to say for many citizens, in the country, differentiating between social media, e-games, video games, esports, AI, cyber, quantum, a lot of these words exist in a bit of a mush for them, and it's all sort of one blob. For those of us who live in that world, of course, it's much more differentiated. So to answer your question, I'm interested in best screen time. Yep. So I think seeing a phone or a tablet as an evil thing is a bit like getting people to burn books. Books have been the most incredible fount of knowledge worldwide, hoisting people out of poverty, bringing people out of ignorance, empowering people. And these amazing bits of technology, these amazing bits of information technology are just one of the most exciting things we can imagine. And to cast them all as evil strikes me as very regressive. Having said that, not intermediating the sort of social media platforms and allowing rampant marketeering to dictate the values of the algorithms that drive behavior on those tablets is utterly bonkers. So we've got to do that. My sense is that in creating a sort of best screen time culture, the games that can be produced can be hugely beneficial to kids, and we can steer children, and did we mention grown-ups, into understand the world better through these amazingly powerful cognitive devices. And so I do a lot of work with esports and games to look at, for instance, how do we pull kids out of cybercrime into cybersecurity? And if you look at the JLR hack, M&S, Co-op, the average age of the hackers involved there, whether they're state-backed or independent, is sort of 18, 19. We are talking very young human beings here. And they're recruited online. They're talent spotted by cybercrimes, whether they be spies or ransomware or just criminals. They're talent spotted on things like Roblox. They're then fed tokens, incentives, if you like, Robux to do something. Then they're fed dollars to do something, and they're brought into these Fagin-like organizations to do cybercrime. We're trying to identify those same skills through the hacking games we spoke earlier, and say to them, look, there is a way of using those skills, these amazing skills, to do good in the world and get paid handsomely for it. So that's one example. Another one would be the International Defence Esports Games that we founded last year, where we're working with our allies around the world to say, look, if you want the best cyber operators, if you want the best drone pilots, or if you want the best war gamers, either people who help make AI-enabled decisions, then the way to find those bits of aptitude, those skills, and develop those skills is going to be through online gaming and esports, but in a structured way where we do think about the ethics and we do think about the behaviors we're trying to encourage and think about the behaviors we're trying to discourage. So I think it's one approach to the sort of online world and how we guide digital natives and digital migrants in a very complex 21st century.
It's fascinating that because if you look at defence, you stereotypically think of defence as hierarchical, it's quite traditional, but modern technology, it requires experimentation, it requires that agility. You're obviously clearly reconciling those two worlds. How do you think we can further get that ingrained further in the defence sector and indeed in government?
So, look, I talk about flipping the pyramid. When I joined the army in the late 80s, there was a triangle with a general at the top of it. Yeah, to my surprise, I find myself as a general now. But in the late 80s, a fairly status quo world, albeit coming to the end of the Cold War, I think the general at the top of the pyramid was fed all of the information, had all of the power, had probably done most of the jobs lower down in the pyramid, so he sort of knew it, and could certainly create the impression that they were all-knowing and had the right answers. And I think in a status quo time, that's perfectly reasonable. Now, I think any good leader in those times did exactly what I'm going to talk about, which was disaggregating power and delegating power downwards whilst retaining responsibility when it went wrong at the top. But I think in a disrupted time, particularly an information revolution, you've got to flip that pyramid upside down. You've got to see leadership as being on the bottom, supporting the base of the pyramid up the top, because those are the people in contact with the battle, with where the rubber meets the road, whatever phrase you want to use. And the huge advantage the internet has brought us, with the AI, is you can give them far more information than you used to be able to give them. So they have the context of the immediate tactical situation, and you can give them much more context, much more strategic context, and then you can unleash them. And of course, when you unleash people, there's a kind of risk that a couple of them go rogue, and you're going to have to take action when they do. But also you can get that huge, explosive, exponential power of unleashing people, because people, I believe, are generally good. And if you give them the context, you explain what we're trying to do together, give them the sort of the end outcome that you're trying to achieve, and then unleash them, you get this amazing growth. And whether that's economics or fighting a war or fighting a battle, that's got to be 21st century leadership, is flipping that pyramid upside down.
I think there's a mindset shift that people need, and they need to understand if they're adaptable towards a sort of slightly different career, esports, gaming, there's a huge, huge opportunity where, especially the point you made around the coders, 25 million to 250 million. Similar thing here, that if you're working in cyber, you can be cyber and e-games. If you're a developer, you can be working in that space. And that will unlock and open more opportunities, not just across commercial sectors, public sector, but also defense sector itself as well.
100%. So, I mentioned earlier meeting people where they are. Well, the simple fact is, if you're under the age of 35 these days, you're spending a lot of your time gaming. The easy data is, they spend the amount of time gaming as Paul and I spent watching television. And our parents probably thought that watching television was awful. It was going to give us square eyes. It was going to break us, until they sat down and watched Tomorrow's World with us. Yeah? And then they realized, wow, these television programs can be really beneficial and they can be really educative. And I meet a lot of people my age who say, Tom, I don't know why you do this nonsense esports, gaming stuff. Isn't that evil? We need to stop our kids doing it. I said, well, if it's evil, what games are your kids playing? They say, oh, I don't know, but they're always locked away in their rooms. So why don't you sit down with them? At least ask them what they're playing. Maybe even play it with them. And you will find that they are creating online communities. And yes, there are risks of online communities that can be mitigated. They're learning communication skills. They're learning coding skills. They're learning skills that allow them to broker between the physical world, the one we're sitting in right now, and the virtual world that this podcast is going to go out through. And they're becoming very good at trading between them. So, these games are brilliant with youngsters who are playing games. To your point, Asad, when you're looking at people moving mid-career, mid-working life,
Yes.
from a trade that was very important when they joined the workforce, but is becoming less important now, where they won't have a university qualification or an A-level or a NVQ that's relevant, putting them on a gaming platform can provide a sort of very, very transparent route to the things they're good at, the things that their mindset and skill set give them. And, again, just going back to that, hacking games, we have a platform called Haptai, with sort of, an AI-driven aptitude platform where you look at what games people play, what their preferences are, how they play them, the skills they have in those games. And it very quickly provides that sort of sorting hat that Harry Potter would talk about. They say, okay, well, have you considered a pivot into this area or that area? And you've got a bit of a gap there, but we can address that with this training. And then you're nailed on, particularly in cybersecurity, whether it's a forensic analyst or a penetration tester or whatever else. It's a very, very quick route to find people skills that they never knew they had and very beneficial careers that they might not have ever considered.
We're coming to the end of our time, so I can't let you get away without not having the quick fire round, the rapid fire round. So just very quickly, what's the most underrated technology?
Going back to defense, as we put a lot more drones into the battle space, how we get deployed energy, deployed electricity to the front edge of the battle area is, I think, much overlooked. And if you think about picks and shovels as well as gold, that's an area people need to be looking at much more profoundly in defense.
And the biggest AI misconception?
That it's all about LLMs.
Absolutely. Cyber attack or misinformation, which is the greater long-term threat?
When they're played together, they are, at the moment, unbreakable.
Yeah.
We need to wake up to that.
So one capability in particular that Britain should invest more in?
Our people, our talent, doubling down, not just on the amazing universities we have, but the amazing education we can give, whether it's teenagers or mid-career people. We have an amazing educational base. We need to leverage it for our advantage.
Is there a technology that worries you most?
Well, then you're going to say, what's the one that excites you? I mean, quantum, in my world of cyber, a colleague of mine at the NSA would say, we're in a world now where AI will find the door and quantum will pick the lock. That scares the bejesus out of me. Yeah. It can also be used to defend those doors and defend those locks. But we need to see both technologies together and understand the tradecraft, including the cognitive tradecraft, the sort of social engineering that allows people to get into our systems. It's usually still through a person, not through the technology. So as quantum comes in, that nexus between AI, quantum, and people is where we really need to see our flank, how to defend it. And that's where the attacking will be done too.
And what's your most important leadership quality, do you think, that you would put across to people?
Yalla. Well, I mean, I think curiosity. In an information age when we're being disrupted, be curious. Be curious, look round corners, pick up stones, look underneath them, talk to people, find new areas of knowledge. But a very close second. Decency sounds a little bit like, play the game, but there's a film out there, the difference between a nice person and a good person. We need good people. They don't always have to be nice. We need good people. So be curious, but remember the purpose in defense is to provide a better peace, to provide a better outcome than you go into. And the sort of decency element, the goodness of that, has to go hand in hand with curiosity. Otherwise, curiosity can take you in the wrong direction.
A slightly lighter leadership question. I had an old boss in sales who was a former Special Forces captain, and he had a piece of Kevlar for his coaster under his coaster. But he always used to make the brew, which belied you could tell what rank he was and where he was. Are you a tea or coffee man?
I'm tea before 10, coffee till 2, then tea again.
Thank you very much. And final question: what gives you the most the confidence, the optimism about defence and UK's position within the defence sector, and especially in this technological era?
So I go back. I think as a country, we've got as many chips on the table. We've got as much potential as any medium-sized country in the world. For humanity, just to broaden it out a bit, Stephen Hawking, before he sadly died, was asked, is AI a threat to humanity? He said, yes, of course it is. He said, but also, because we're going to start building these amazing thinking machines, we're also, for the first time in history, going to understand the full potential of the human brain. And that gives me hope that we are really going to start to get to grips with this amazing bit of compute and memory that sits between our ears, that importantly, in a climate change world, this runs off very low wattage, very low power. So what gives me hope is we, and this country is as well placed as any, are going to find new architectures beyond von Neumann, for the geeks in your audience, the nerds in your audience, beyond von Neumann, that provide both compute and memory, and that's going to spur us forward both as a country, but also as humans, into this very exciting, but also quite threatened world.
Which book would you recommend to leaders?
Well, I went to the launch of a book, actually, of a friend of mine the other day, which I thought was really good. It's called Rewire or Retire. And it really speaks about the fact that, you may be a leader, you may have been in your industry for 30 or 40 years, you might be a general or a politician or whatever, but AI is changing almost everything. And rewiring your brain, rethinking about your skills, rethinking about what you think about power and how you lead and how you assert authority, you've got to rewire that. And if you can't, you need to think about getting out of Dodge and leaving the field for somebody who has rewired their brain. So Rewire or Retire by Mark O'Ryan.
Lieutenant General Sir Tom Copinger-Symes, thank you so much. Asad, that was really a fascinating conversation, wasn't it? I mean, I think it shows that how technology is so central to national resilience, and what we've got to do to succeed. It's really dependent on the people as much as it is systems.
I think on the people bit, there are definitely lots of opportunities that General Tom has discussed here today. So I'd heavily ask people to start looking into some of these areas across tech, across esports, gaming. There are a few apps that he's mentioned that they've been working on. So opportunity-wise, it's not, I guess AI isn't taking over people, it's the people that are driving AI. That's the key initiative that we do need to bring out, and the education piece around what is defence doing, why is it important to every country, especially Great Britain, and why we do need to look into it further. I'd highly recommend people to go deep down into that as well.
Well, I think we've going down the latest trend in cinema, like the Harry Potter movies and other things, and we're having to split this into two because there's so much packed into there. So there's going to be Sir Tom Part 1 and Sir Tom Part 2. So that'll be really good to look forward to. But look, if you've enjoyed this, please do subscribe, look at the YouTube channel, Spotify for audio, wherever you get your normal podcasts. As usual, please do comment, suggest future guests, suggest future topics that we can look at. And we're really looking forward to continuing this journey, working out where the intersection is from government, with SMEs, with primes, there's big companies, and the application of technology in any number of sectors that impinge on all of our lives. Thank you very much.